What would you do if every morning, without fail, an ATV came tearing through your property, kicking up dirt, churning your grass into mud, and the driver, let's call her Karen, claimed she had every right to be there? Now, imagine that you're not even part of the HOA she keeps citing. Sounds ridiculous, right? Welcome to my life. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she was taking a shortcut one time and wouldn't do it again. But the next morning, and the morning after that, and every day that followed, Karen showed up like clockwork, revving her obnoxiously loud neon-pink ATV and cutting straight across my yard like it was her personal racetrack. The first time I caught her in the act, I stepped onto my porch and waved her down. She didn't stop. She didn't slow. She barely even acknowledged me, just tilted her chin up with that signature Karen smugness and gave me the kind of dismissive wave you'd give to a waiter after asking for extra ranch. Then she was gone, leaving nothing but deep tire tracks and a cloud of dust in her wake. The next day, I was ready. This time, I walked straight into her path, forcing her to stop. She revved the engine, staring at me through her oversized sunglasses like I was the one trespassing. "Why are you cutting through my property?" I asked, as calmly as I could. She scoffed like I had just asked if the sky was blue. "This is an HOA-maintained trail. I have every right to be here." I blinked. "What? I'm not even in the HOA." She waved a manicured hand like that detail didn't matter. "All paths in this neighborhood fall under HOA jurisdiction." I stared at her, dumbfounded. That's not how property ownership works. Instead of arguing, she did what Karen does best, slammed the gas and tore off, drowning out anything else I had to say. And that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, her joyrides became more frequent, more aggressive, and more entitled. No matter how many times I confronted her, she always had a new excuse. "The HOA says I can, this land has always been open for community use, and my personal favorite, you're just jealous because you don't have an ATV." It was like arguing with a brick wall, if that wall also had an engine and an overinflated sense of self-importance. Then came the morning it rained. The ground was still soft, thick with mud, when Karen came flying through at full speed, only to hit a patch of wet soil and sink. The squelch was beautiful. Karen, now stuck in knee-deep mud, flailed her arms like a stranded turtle before spotting me watching from my porch. Her helmet bobbled as she pointed a furious finger in my direction. "This is your fault," she shrieked. I raised an eyebrow. "How is this my fault?" "You should have put up a sign," she snapped. "A sign that says, 'Hey, don't drive your ATV through my yard'?" I folded my arms. "You already know it's my property." Her face turned redder than her ATV's taillights. She stomped her foot, demanded I help push her out, and when I refused, she pulled out her phone, muttering about reporting me to the HOA. I laughed. "Go ahead. They don't control my land." She made a big show of pretending to dial before storming off on foot, leaving her ATV behind like a tantrum-throwing child abandoning their toy. For a brief moment, I considered calling a tow truck just to watch her fork over the cash for her mistake. But I figured letting her stew in her own mess was punishment enough. Hours later, she returned, dragging her exhausted husband, Greg, along for the retrieval mission. The poor guy looked like he'd fought too many battles and lost every single one. Without a word to me, he helped her push the ATV free while she ranted about how people in this neighborhood have no respect. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching the disaster unfold. I had a feeling this wasn't over. And I was right. Because Karen wasn't just persistent, she was about to take this to a whole new level. I had hoped, foolishly, that after her embarrassing ATV mud fiasco, Karen would take the loss and move on. Maybe even develop some self-awareness. But no. If anything, her entitlement hit an all-time high. Now, Instead of just riding through my yard, she was doubling down, tearing through at all hours, morning, afternoon, sometimes even at night. It was like she was trying to prove a point. I wasn't about to let her win. Since Karen wouldn't listen to reason, I decided to take it up with the people who should have had the authority to stop her, the HOA board. Even though I wasn't a member, they were the ones she kept citing, so surely they'd have something to say about her terrorizing a property that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. The HOA office was a small, unimpressive building near the neighborhood entrance. Inside, a handful of board members sat around a conference table, flipping through papers and pretending to look busy. The moment I mentioned Karen, they exchanged uneasy glances like kids caught cheating on a test. "Yeah, we can't really do much about her," said a guy named Tyler Brooks, one of the younger board members. I frowned. "She's trespassing. On private property. Surely that breaks some kind of rule." A woman who looked like she regretted ever volunteering for this job sighed. "She does this to everyone. We've warned her before, but, well, she doesn't listen." That was it? That was their solution? Just let her do whatever she wants. "So, you're telling me she gets to ride roughshod over my land, tear up my property, and there's nothing you can do?" Tyler rubbed the back of his neck. "She's persistent. Persistent." That was one hell of an understatement. Disgusted, I turned to leave. But as I stepped outside, Tyler followed me. "Listen," he said in a low voice, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "If you really want to get her off your back, you gotta play her game." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you mean?" "Karen only backs down when she's forced to," he said. "She thinks HOA rules protect her, but they don't. If you push back hard enough, she'll break her own rules without even realizing it. And when she does, that's when you go after her." That stuck with me. That night, as I sat on my porch listening to Karen's ATV revving in the distance, I realized something. She thought she was untouchable. She genuinely believed she had the power here, that her HOA connections made her invincible. Maybe it was time to prove her wrong. The next morning, as expected, her engine roared to life before the sun had even fully risen. The difference? This time, I was ready. Instead of just standing helplessly on my porch watching the destruction unfold, I did something different. I grabbed my phone. And I followed her. At first, Karen didn't seem to notice. She was too busy pretending she was in some kind of off-road rally, swerving through my yard like she had a personal vendetta against my grass. But when she glanced back and saw me walking directly behind her, recording every second, her helmeted head snapped forward in panic. And then, as if flipping a switch, she jammed on the brakes, spun her ATV around, and started screaming. "You're trespassing." I stared at her, incredulous. "I'm what?" Her finger jabbed at me like she was about to call in an airstrike. "You can't be here." I let out an actual laugh. "Karen. This is my property." She crossed her arms, nostrils flaring. "It's an HOA-maintained pathway, and you're harassing me." "Oh, so it's private now?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because 5 minutes ago, you were arguing it was a public trail." Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "That's different." "How?" Instead of answering, she reached for her phone. "I'm calling the cops." I almost wanted to see how this would play out. Would she really dial 911 and tell them she was being followed by the legal owner of the property she'd been trespassing on for weeks? Spoiler alert, yes. She would. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Karen launched into a dramatic performance that deserved an Academy Award. "He's harassing me," she wailed, clutching her chest like she had just been assaulted. "He's been lurking in the bushes, chasing me down." I let her talk. I let her spin her absurd little story. And when the officers finally turned to me, I held up my phone and hit play. The video showed Karen, day after day, tearing through my property like she was training for the X Games. It captured her dismissing me, arguing that she had the right to be there, and then screaming when I followed her on my own land. The older officer exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, is this your property?" he asked, gesturing to me. Karen hesitated. Then, with the confidence of a toddler caught with cookie crumbs all over their face, she nodded. "Yes." The officer blinked. "So, you own his land?" "Well, not technically, but the HOA." The younger officer cut her off. "Ma'am, the HOA doesn't own private residences. But the rules say I can. The rules don't override property deeds." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then, in a last-ditch effort, she tried to flip the script. "Well, he was following me. That's harassment." The older officer scratched his head, glancing at my phone again. "Ma'am, he was walking on his own land. You, on the other hand, were driving through it on an ATV." Karen scoffed. "That's not the point." The officer turned to me. "Would you like to press charges for trespassing?" I pretended to consider it. Watching Karen's face morph into sheer panic was almost enough. "Almost." "No," I said finally, tucking my phone back into my pocket. "But I will be filing a formal complaint with the HOA." For the first time since this nightmare began, Karen shut up. The officers left, and Karen did something I had never seen her do before. She left without a word. No screaming. No threats. Just a quiet, fuming retreat. But that wasn't the end. Because later that day, I got a message from Tyler. It was a link to an online forum. Karen had apparently been rallying the neighborhood, calling me a dangerous stalker and urging people to sign a petition to have me removed from the community. The best part? Not a single person had signed it. Not even her husband. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when every shred of evidence was stacked against her. The police shutting her down should have been enough, but it only seemed to fuel her delusions. Within a day, she had shifted from her usual petty antics to full-blown retaliation mode. If she couldn't win by force, she was going to play dirty. The first sign of escalation came when I woke up to find garbage scattered across my yard. Not just a little either. Someone had dumped bags of trash, broken furniture, and even a few suspiciously rotten pumpkins right in the middle of my driveway. At first, I assumed it was some random neighborhood prank, until I checked my security cameras. There she was. Karen. At 2 in the morning. Dragging black garbage bags from her SUV and gleefully tossing them across my lawn like some deranged raccoon. I watched, incredulous, as she stomped back and forth, carefully arranging the mess like she was creating some modern art piece of suburban rage. The best part? Right before she left, she pulled out her phone, snapped a few photos, and drove off. I didn't have to wonder why. By mid-morning, I had a crisp white envelope sitting in my mailbox. An HOA violation notice. The reason? Failure to maintain property in accordance with HOA standards. I actually laughed. She wasn't even being subtle. She had set me up. I marched straight to the HOA office, security footage loaded on my phone, fully prepared to make someone regret ever printing that notice. But before I could even slam the letter down on the desk, Tyler Brooks was already waving me over, looking exhausted. "Let me guess," he said, rubbing his temples. "Trash violation?" I narrowed my eyes. "How did you know?" He sighed. "Because Karen just sent 6 emails to the board about it. She even attached pictures. Said you were bringing down the neighborhood aesthetic." I let out a slow breath, then turned my phone around. "Great. Then you'll love this footage of her dumping it." The silence that followed was beautiful. Tyler winced, took my phone, and after watching for a minute, exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I said. So I assume this little violation is going to be revoked. Revoked? He shook his head. Karen's about to get one. That should have been enough to shut her down, but she wasn't done yet. That night, Tyler texted me a screenshot from an online forum. Karen had escalated her smear campaign. The title? Stalker in the neighborhood, we need him gone. The post itself was unhinged. She called me dangerous, aggressive, a known troublemaker who followed people and harassed women. She urged people to sign a petition demanding my removal from the community. There was just one problem. Not a single person had signed it. Not even Greg, her husband. Still, I was pissed. She was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. If she wanted to use the HOA as a weapon, then fine. Two could play that game. The next morning, I did a deep dive into the HOA regulations. And that's when I struck gold. Karen had been violating HOA rules for years. Her shed? 2 feet over the allowed property line. Her garden gnomes? Too many, exceeding the approved aesthetic limit. Her ATV? Unregistered. Completely banned from community spaces. I submitted formal complaints for every single violation. By that evening, Karen had 6 violation notices waiting in her mailbox. She was furious. I watched from my porch as she stormed outside, ripping the letters open one by one, getting angrier with each one. Then, in a fit of rage, she stomped over to her yard and began yanking her beloved garden gnomes out of the ground. She caught sight of me watching. Enjoying yourself, she snapped. I grinned. Actually? Yeah. A little. She stormed inside, slamming the door so hard it rattled her wind chimes. For the first time in weeks, my yard was ATV-free. No roaring engines. No tire tracks. No Karen. It should have been the end. But something told me she wasn't done yet. For the first time in weeks, my property was quiet. No revving ATV, no entitled screeching, no deep tire tracks scarring my lawn. It should have been a victory. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't done. She was too bitter, too stubborn, too desperate to go out quietly. And I was right. A few days after she was hit with her HOA violations, I stepped outside to find Karen hammering a wooden sign into the edge of my property. I strolled over, already bracing for whatever fresh nonsense she had cooked up this time. The sign read, "Private highway, no trespassing." I burst out laughing. Seriously? You think a homemade sign changes property laws? She spun around, arms crossed, her face tight with righteous fury. It's official. The HOA approved it. I tilted my head. Oh, really? That's funny, because I have a copy of the letter they sent you, confirming you were the one trespassing. Want me to forward it to you? Her face twitched. For a second, I thought she might actually back down. Then, with a huff, she ripped the sign out of the ground and stomped back to her house without another word. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The following weekend, I got a text from Tyler. You might want to show up to the HOA meeting. Karen's pulling something big. I wasn't surprised. At this point, it was like she was cycling through every bad idea she could think of. So I showed up. And sure enough, there she was, standing at the front of the community hall, passionately waving a stack of papers. This neighborhood has standards, she declared, her voice full of exaggerated outrage. And certain people are bringing down our property values. I frowned. She wasn't just ranting. She was holding a petition. As many of you know, she continued dramatically, we've had an issue with trespassing and harassment. I have personally been stalked, threatened, and targeted in my own neighborhood. I raised an eyebrow. You mean on my property? She ignored me. Which is why I am officially submitting this petition to have problem homeowners removed from the community. I looked around. Nobody was clapping. In fact, most people looked either confused or deeply uncomfortable. Tyler raised a hand. Karen, what exactly do you mean by removed? She lifted her chin. People who disrupt the peace should be forced to sell their homes. I blinked. You want to evict me from my own house? The house I own. Because you got fined? She turned bright red. You were aggressive. I walked behind you, I said dryly. You followed me. On my property. Her mouth opened and closed, but she had no rebuttal. Tyler snatched the petition from her hands and flipped through it. His eyebrows shot up. Karen, he said slowly, there are literally 0 signatures on this. Her jaw clenched. That's because people are scared. Scared of what? Someone else muttered. A guy barbecuing on his own deck? Karen looked around, realizing, finally, that she had absolutely no support. Then, with as much dignity as she could muster, she snatched the papers back, mumbled something about corruption, and stormed out. The HOA board took an official vote right then and there. Karen was placed on HOA probation, meaning any future violations would result in even steeper fines. That included any unauthorized ATV joyrides. That should have been the final nail in the coffin. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. A few weeks passed, and for the first time in ages, things were quiet. No roaring ATV. No pointless screaming. No dramatic HOA meetings where Karen tried, and failed, to evict me from my own property. It was almost peaceful. Almost. Then, one morning, a city zoning official knocked on my door. Are you aware that there's been a zoning complaint filed against your property? He asked, clipboard in hand. I blinked. What? He handed me a notice. Someone reported that your property line extends onto HOA-maintained land. I barely stopped myself from laughing. Let me guess. Karen? The official sighed. I can't disclose that information, but, you're not the first person in this neighborhood to get a suspiciously similar complaint. I shook my head. Well, this is my private land. I have the deed to prove it. Then this should be a quick review, he said, already looking exhausted. Sure enough, after checking the records, the zoning official confirmed that my property was exactly where it was supposed to be. The complaint? Completely bogus. But then, plot twist. The official flipped through his documents, frowning. Funny thing, he said, tapping his clipboard. It actually looks like her property is in violation. I frowned. Come again? He tapped the paper. Her fence and shed? They extend 2 feet into public land. I stared at him. You're telling me that Karen, the same woman who has spent months screaming about HOA rules and property lines, has been breaking zoning laws herself this whole time? Looks like it. It took everything in me not to double over laughing. A few days later, another city official arrived. This time, to deliver Karen a notice. Apparently, her zoning violation meant she had 2 choices. Pay to have her fence and shed moved onto her own property. Face a serious fine. Karen, being Karen, naturally refused to accept reality. Instead of fixing the problem, she tried to argue with the city about why the rules didn't apply to her. It went about as well as you'd expect. Within 2 weeks, she was forced to pay thousands in fines. And the best part? Because she ignored the first notice, she also had to pay extra for non-compliance. Rumors spread quickly. The once feared HOA Karen was now the biggest rule-breaker in the neighborhood. Her rage was nuclear. The day she finally caved and had her fence torn down, she was furious. I watched from my porch as she stomped around her yard, barking at the workers moving her shed. She caught sight of me watching and shot me a look so intense it could have melted steel. "Happy now?" she snapped. I sipped my coffee. Ecstatic. For the next few weeks, Karen tried her best to pretend she still had the upper hand. She avoided me at all costs, but the neighborhood had turned against her. Even her fellow HOA members wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Then, one day, the "For Sale" sign appeared in her yard. The "For Sale" sign in Karen's yard was the most beautiful thing I had seen in months. It stood there like a silent surrender, a white flag disguised as a real estate listing. The woman who had spent months terrorizing me, the HOA, and half the neighborhood was finally giving up. I could only imagine how much it killed her to admit defeat, but after the fines, the HOA probation, the zoning violation, and the complete destruction of her so-called reputation, she had run out of options. The once untouchable queen of the HOA had been reduced to just another homeowner trying to flee the mess she created. And yet, in true Karen fashion, she still had one last petty move up her sleeve. A few days before the moving trucks arrived, I got another letter from the HOA. For a moment, I thought she had tried to report me again, some last-ditch attempt at revenge before she left. But when I opened it, I nearly laughed out loud. The letter stated that Karen had filed one final complaint against me, claiming that my property was unfit and should be reevaluated for compliance. It was pathetic. Even when she was packing up to leave, she still couldn't let it go. I called Tyler, who was already aware of her latest stunt. He sounded exhausted but amused. "Yeah, don't worry about it. The board threw it out immediately. We're all just waiting for her to be someone else's problem now." And just like that, Karen was gone. The HOA hosted a neighborhood barbecue the same weekend her moving truck pulled out of the driveway. It wasn't an official celebration of her departure, but the timing was suspiciously perfect. Even Greg, her husband, showed up, alone. No one mentioned Karen. No one asked where she was. It was like the entire neighborhood collectively decided to erase her existence. For the first time in months, I could sit on my porch in peace. No ATVs. No screaming. No Karen. Just quiet. Then, a few weeks later, a moving truck pulled into Karen's old driveway. I watched as a woman stepped out, stretching and surveying the house. She caught me looking and waved. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood," I said. She smiled. "Thanks. I just moved in. My name's Karen." I froze. She laughed. "Don't worry. Not that kind of Karen." I exhaled, relieved. Maybe this one wouldn't come with an ATV. HOAs can be useful, but when the wrong person gets control, they can turn into absolute nightmares. Have you ever dealt with an out-of-control HOA or a Karen on a power trip? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.